The anime begins in high school with a protagonist named Haruo Oreki talking to his friend and classmate Satoshi Fuku, where the protagonist tells him that people tend to want to remember their high school times either because they belong to a club or were very sociable. However, there are people who do not want it that way and try not to belong to any club, not study, or not socialize to keep a low profile like Haruo's case in order to live alone. But this year, everything will change since he received a letter from his sister, who is in India, asking him to join the Classics Club. Since it has no members and she does not want the club to dissolve, his friend is amazed because it is not normal for him. But the young man must do it since he is by his sister, although this has a positive side according to Satoshi, and that is that if there are no members in the club, he has the place all to himself and it can be considered his private corner. At the end of classes, the protagonist heads to the Classics Club, and upon arrival, he notices that the door is closed, so he uses the key he took from the teacher's lounge. Upon entering, he notices that a student named Iru Chitanda is there. She is glad because she says she knows him, although he doesn't know her. The girl says she joined the club for personal reasons, but Haru, seeing that the club has someone else, his sister must be happy since it will not dissolve, so he decides to leave. But before that, he gives the key to the girl to close when she leaves, so he realizes that the student was locked in, so he has doubts about how she got in. However, she didn't know, so she gets scared because she could have been locked in. But at that moment, they realize that Satoshi is eavesdropping on their conversation. But the young man says he felt intrigued since his friend was with a girl. When he introduces himself, he realizes that the girl belongs to one of the 4 exponential families of the country, which are very famous. But at that moment, he feels more interested in how the student got locked in just like her, so Haru, after asking the girl questions, deduces that maybe the janitor, while doing his job, closed the door without knowing that the girl was there since he has a master key. So he is right. At the end of the day, Chitanda asks the 2 boys to stay in the club, so Satoshi accepts, while the protagonist has no other option since he filled out the application from the beginning. Later, both the student and the protagonist's friend talk about who should be the club's president, while Haru thinks that his sister should feel happy since her club will not dissolve and his days of tranquility are over. But now he has another problem, and it's the girl he met. The next day, Satoshi tells his friend about a mysterious story that is going around the school where a student hears a melody coming from the music room, but when she enters, the music stops, and at that moment, in the darkness, a young girl with long hair covering her face stands up and stares at her. So they believe she's a pianist from a long time ago. This story is considered in the school as the second wonder. All this while the protagonist does his homework. Since he forgot it, however, he asks his friend about the first wonder. Later, Chitanda arrives to submit her form for the club as they decided that she will be the president. At that moment, the boys take the opportunity to tell the girl about a secret club, since every year there are many clubs as they fill the bulletin board with posters, so they recruit many students. However, there are unauthorized clubs, like in this case, the one calling itself Golden Web, so they must remove it and report it. Although this year they also expect that to happen, but they still haven't managed to find it. The student feels intrigued, so the protagonist proposes to go look for them since he knew she would say that. When they arrive at the bulletin board, Chitanda cannot see anything, but Haru manages to find them on a small paper under a poster. At the end of the day, the protagonist reveals that everything was planned to be able to go to the teacher's lounge, take the essay, and go home. Then he says that according to his deduction with the music room is that a pianist closed the curtains and lay down to sleep, but put a melody to wake up before the school closes, and once the student entered, she saw the pianist and got scared. After that deduction, the friends separate and go home. Chapter 2. It's been a month since the protagonist joined the Classics Club at his sister's request. However, the young man only goes when he's bored, but Chitanda tells him they shouldn't be wasting time. So she proposes making an anthology since it's a tradition in the club. Despite not wanting to, he ends up accepting. So they search for the past anthologies in the classroom but can't find them, so they go to the library. Upon arrival, they encounter Imura Mayaka, a student who helps out there and is a childhood friend of the protagonist and Satoshi. Chitanda tries to ask about the club's anthologies to understand what it's about since they didn't know, but unfortunately, they're not there, so they decide to wait for the librarian. Because of this, Haru leaves, but Satoshi convinces him to stay and listen to Mayaka's story and test the young man's brain. According to the story, there's a popular but unwanted book in the library that different people request and return on the same day. This has been happening over the past few weeks. The protagonist has no interest in it, but it's not the case for Chitanda, as she's intrigued and asks her companion to help solve the case since he's been able to solve others before, so he has no choice but to accept. After thinking for a bit, Haru thinks it's just a coincidence, but he knows Chitanda won't believe it, so his deduction is based on 2 options. The first is that the girls have no relation and the book is just popular on those days, and the second is that the girls belong to a group and request the book in turn for some reason like a riddle, but that doesn't convince him. However, when they were about to give up, Chitanda smells a peculiar odor in the book, so she thinks it's paint, although only she can smell it. At that moment, Haru has a deduction, so he asks the girl for a mission. but they end up both going with Mayaka since she wanted to see how good her friend was. The young man says he feels this has to do with the art club, and upon arrival, the girls are surprised because he was right as they could see portraits of the girls with the book. Both applaud him and are interested in knowing what's on the young man's mind, while he is interested in Chitanda's sense of smell. When they return to the librarian returns, and after asking about the Classics Club and its anthologies, she gets surprised for a moment but says she doesn't know about them as there are no records, and they don't keep that in the library, so the boys think it was all in vain. On the weekend, the protagonist receives a call from Chitanda asking to meet as she needed to tell him something. When Haruo is there, he waits for his friend as she's taking too long, but upon arrival, he notices she's acting strange and not saying what she wanted to tell him, so he decides to leave, but the girl stops him and asks him to listen to her. He thinks she's going to confess something, and he's surprised when she confirms it by telling him to take it as a confession. Chapter 3. After what happened, Chitanda says she'll make a request, and it's something she could solve herself but still wants him to listen. It's about her uncle, Jun Sekitani, because she wants to remember what he once told her when she was a child. He used to answer all of her questions as if he knew everything, however. He avoided just one question, and it was about the Classics Club. Once he relented, his answer made her cry, but for some reason, she doesn't remember. When she entered high school, she couldn't stop thinking about it, so she saw an opportunity to find out, so she joined the club. When she entered, she went to the teacher's lounge to search for answers from 45 years ago, but none of them could answer, so she asked for the young man's help since he was able to solve other mysteries. After hearing her request, Haruo doesn't accept since he thinks she has enough time to find out during her high school years, but she says she wants to find out before her uncle passed away because in her family, if nothing is known about a relative for 7 years, it is considered that they lost their life and they are already preparing for the funeral. The protagonist says he can't take her request, but will keep an eye on it, and if he finds out anything, he will let her know, so the girl accepts. Some time passes and exams come, so the clubs are not active, so they are not meeting, although they should be. At the end of the exams, the young man feels exhausted, but he sees that his sister wrote him a letter again, telling him that several things didn't go well, but she still cares about how the club is and if they will make an anthology since they did it every year. However, she says that these documents are not kept in the library, but are in the meeting room and are stored in a safe that is not closed, leaving the young man surprised. The next day, the protagonist gathers all the club members, including Mayaka. The young man tells the guys about the letter and that it is safe, but no matter how much they searched, they didn't find it in the room, and this is because in previous years, the club's meeting room was in the biology room, so they go to look for it. Upon arrival, Haruo notices something strange without counting that the door is closed, but after insisting, the student comes out of there and says he belongs to the News Bulletin Club. The guys ask to enter to look for what belongs to them, but the guy doesn't let them, but then changes his mind and accepts. The girls enter and start looking while the protagonist can see that there are no members in the club. The student gets nervous and asks them to leave since they didn't find anything. But Haruo tries to speed things up and says he only needs the documents and could ask for help to have the place registered so in case they find the anthologies to leave them in their room while they meet in the library. After what happened, the club kids return to the room and find the anthologies. Mayaka asks how he did it, to which Haruo says he blackmailed him since he realized there were sensors at the entrance of the room, and when he was inside, he noticed it was ventilating the place because there was a smell of tobacco in the place, and if he asked for help to register the place, they were going to find out that the son of an exponential family was in bad influences, so he had no escape. But to do what they asked, since he assumed that the safe was under his boxes, and since it wasn't closed, he used it to hide his cigarettes. Afterwards, Chitanda is very surprised because the book her uncle showed her that time was there, and this book is called Hyouka, and it's the second book. She asks the young man to read it to her, and they realize that these anthologies go back to her uncle's time, so she thinks something happened the year before that book, but they hear Mayaka say that the first book of the anthology is missing. Chapter 4. After what happened, the protagonist tells Chitanda that the investigation would feel more confident if they consult with Mayaka and Satoshi. She accepts it, and the next day she shares her purpose in the club and asks for help to discover the truth of what happened to her uncle Jun Sekitani 45 years ago. The guys accept it because they are now also curious, while Haruo decides that if they do well on this topic, they could use it for their anthology this year, so the investigation becomes a priority for all members. After a few days, Satoshi and Haruo meet on the way to Chitanda's house to start the investigation. Upon arrival, the guys notice that their classmate's house is huge, and the meeting begins as Mayaka was already there. The guys propose that each one starts giving their own conclusions of the investigation, and the first to start is the club president, Chitanda. Her conclusion is that her uncle was involved in some kind of aggression incident, and by defending something, he performed a heroic feat, and for that reason, he was expelled from the institution. Satoshi and Haruo disagree with this theory as there was a dispute between students and administrators at that time, so it's unlikely that the conflict was among students. Next is Mayaka. According to her, her theory is totally different, as it is based on magazine clippings where she concluded that there was tension between authorities and students in which Sekatane was involved, leading to his expulsion. Again, the guys intervene and disagree as there is a 4-month gap between the incident and his expulsion, so it wouldn't be possible. Thirdly, it's Satoshi's turn, and according to his theory and the data collected, there was no violence, and the word "we" in the data refers to all students, and they were led by someone who had the support of all, so it could simply be a movement. However, Haotoru disagrees as there is no evidence that Jun was involved in it. Lastly, it's the protagonist's turn, but for the first time he feels nervous as apparently he hasn't prepared anything. So he asks to go to the bathroom. On the way, he comes across Chitanda's room and can see how much effort she put into the investigation. So upon returning, he decides to make an effort and start with his theory using the others. According to him, Sekatane was involved in a student protest against the school authorities due to the cultural festival, since they wanted to reduce it to a few days, but thanks to Jun, who was the leader of the protest, they reached an agreement in which the festival would last for 5 days. But as a consequence, he was expelled, although it happened months later when everything calmed down, and since then, he has been considered a hero in the club. Everyone is surprised as it is the most probable theory, and thus the meeting ends and each goes home deciding to use it for their anthology. When everyone leaves, Chitanda is overwhelmed as she still doesn't know why she cried that day she heard the story. Chapter 5. After the meeting, the protagonist and his friend head home. On the way, Satoshi remarks that the young man has put too much effort into his theory, even into solving previous cases, so he thinks it's because of Chitanda. However, Haotoru only did it after seeing his clubmate putting in so much effort into investigating and drawing her conclusions, so he decided to spend a bit of his energy too, although he also thinks he'd like his life to be more colorful, like his friends or even like Chitanda's uncle. Later, when the protagonist is at home, he reads his sister's letter again, and at that moment, he receives a call from her. The young man tells her about the club and that they are working on the anthology based on Hyouka and Jun Sekatane for the cultural festival. She asks him if they still talk about that story as it was tragic and depressing which happened at the Kanya festival. Haotoru is surprised by what he heard, but when he wants to ask questions, his sister cuts the call short as she had no more time to talk, leaving the young man confused since the man's story hasn't finished yet. So he decides to review all the data since if the story was tragic, the conclusion he gave to Chitanda is wrong. The protagonist starts to doubt if at that time he sacrificed himself for his classmates, and if so, maybe his life wasn't as colorful as he thought because it ended with expulsion, so he decides to investigate what happened. The next day, the protagonist gathers the other club members and tells them that his theory was inconclusive, so he needs to fill in the gaps, but for that, they must speak with the writer of Hyouka, who turned out to be the librarian named Yuko Atoigawa, who a few days earlier had been asked about the anthologies, but she responded that she didn't know anything about it. When they arrive at the meeting with her, Haotoru asks her to confirm her maiden name as that was the one she signed the book with. Later, she recounts that that year, the festival was her reason for living, but the year she entered, the student movements were growing too much, and it was very scandalous. And that year, the director decided to shorten the festival, so the students saw it as a and started protests. However, no student wanted to take the lead as they feared punishment, and unfortunately, Jun Sekatane drew the shortest straw and was chosen as the leader of the movement, although it was all organized by another student whose name was never known. The festival was not shortened at that moment, but the movement went further as one night in the middle of the protest, they set fire to the martial arts hall. Although at that moment, the issue was not discussed, and no one was punished. However, after a few months, the authorities brought up the issue again, and since the student body did not want to respond, their representative, Sekatane, was expelled. No student decided to intervene, they just watched what happened, but even so, Jun remained calm until the end. However, after a few years, the festival was still shortened. After this explanation, the guys remained doubtful about the name of the festival since at that time it was called the Kanya Festival. So they believe it's because of Sekatane since they consider him a hero, but the term is misleading as he didn't want to be a hero and was expelled for assuming responsibility. Chitanda's question still remains about knowing the reason for the title Hyouka, and although she tries to pretend she doesn't know, Haotoru managed to decipher its meaning in English as it's a pun on the phrase "I scream," which means the scream of anguish. At that moment, Chitanda begins to remember that moment she lived with her uncle, and that was the reason she cried, as according to the cover, her uncle symbolizes the rabbit that was caught by the wolf, while the other rabbits that only watch symbolize the students. The young woman, after discovering this, becomes excited and thanks her friend for helping her remember. After they discover the truth, they begin to plan their anthology and ask the protagonist to write it since he was the one who deduced it. Later, Haotoru writes a letter to his sister to report and ask her what was the reason she asked him to join the club as he thinks she knew something and would change. Chapter 6. After a few days, the protagonist is bored in class, but suddenly he hears noises coming from the next classroom and recognizes one of the voices as Chitanda's, who is in an argument with the teacher. However, once everything subsides, Haotoru's class continues. After class at the Classics Club, Mayaka is upset with Satoshi for leaving her stranded in the rain without contacting her. As the shouting doesn't stop, Eru tries to intervene, but is unsuccessful. However, Eru steps in and asks Mayaka to take a breather, to which she agrees, ending their argument. Then, everyone starts talking about how they each behave when they get upset, realizing that Chitanda never gets angry and doesn't even have a characteristic of the 7 deadly sins, so they call her a saint. However, this annoys the young woman because, according to her, the 7 deadly sins are actually essential. Without pride, people wouldn't have confidence in themselves. Without a bit of greed, someone couldn't support a family, and without envy, no one would have the desire to create new things that could surpass others. So she doesn't see anything wrong with getting angry. Mikado asks her how she always stays so calm, and she responds that it's because she prefers to conserve energy. At that moment, Haruo starts to see her as an angel because he thinks he's found his soulmate, but then Chitanda says it was just a joke because she tends to get angry after all. So the protagonist remembers what happened in the first class period, so he asks her what happened, although the young woman doesn't remember, so she asks her clubmate for help again to decipher what happened. Chitanda recounts that Omichi is the math teacher who asked one of his students to solve an equation, but no student could answer correctly, so the teacher started scolding them, hitting the blackboard while shouting. Finally, the young woman stood up and confronted him about his class because it wasn't a topic they were studying, and she asked him to check her notebook. The teacher realized his mistake, apologized, and the class continued. Haruo doesn't see anything strange about all this, but Chitanda remembers that she actually wanted to know why her teacher acted that way. Satoshi says that usually Omichi is very strict with his students, but it's because he's also strict with himself and tends to take notes on the last class he gave in each classroom. Later, Satoshi remembers that in his class, they already covered the topics where the teacher got confused, so immediately Haruo realizes what the mistake was, as the teacher wrote the class letters in lowercase, confusing Class A with Class D. Then Chitanda realized that it was probably hard for her teacher because he unintentionally made a mistake, but Mayaka says that what she did was right because there was an injustice. Chapter 7. Haruo and the rest of the Classics Club head to the hot springs in the town of Zazen as a gesture of gratitude from Chitanda as they helped her solve the mystery of her uncle. After the bus trip, the members wait to be taken to the place where they will stay thanks to Mikaya being able to secure a reservation due to having relatives in the area. However, Haruo feels tired even though only an hour and a half has passed. When they arrive at the inn, the protagonist decides to go to the hot springs, and on the way he meets Chitanda, and they start talking about siblings and how much she would have liked to have one since she is an only child. Later, she is surprised because she thought the hot springs would have mixed baths, leaving the protagonist nervous. When Haruo enters the hot springs, he encounters his friend, but at that moment, he begins to imagine the young woman entering the hot springs, but he also starts to feel unwell and faints. After this happens, Satoshi takes his friend to the room to rest, although he tells him that he cannot enjoy the trip. Later, Chitanda arrives because she wanted to know how he was, and she realizes that he has a fever. Although she tries to help him, he doesn't accept it because he feels uncomfortable and just rests. Over time, the young man cannot sleep, and at that moment, he hears his friends telling stories, and one of them is about a man who stayed in that place but was too strange since he didn't want any service, and one day, when they entered his room because of a scream, they found him. Therefore, later, all those who stayed in that room felt a strange presence, and even a guest lost his life due to an illness. But due to the rumors, they decided to rebuild the place. During their first night at the inn, Mayaka said she had seen the shadow of a man in the room from the story, to which Chitanda also said she had seen the same thing, and because she was scared, they asked Haruo to help them solve this mystery. Haruo had no choice but to agree and start investigating. First, Haruo deduced that if both saw a shadow, then it must be the shadow of something that was being illuminated by the moonlight, which was the only light source that night, so they decided to investigate the scene. But they discover that access to that place is prohibited. The protagonist and the young woman meet Keo Zena, who is a little nervous and tells them that the second floor of the inn is used as a warehouse. And when they investigate outside the room, Haruo realizes that the floor is wet because it rained a little during the night. After lunch, Rai, one of the girls from the place, shows off her new yukata to everyone. And at that moment, Haruo notices a strange shadow watching him from the hallway. Shortly after, the protagonist and Chitanda return to the hot springs, and the young man finds Satoshi there, who tells him that there was a summer festival in the town. Haruo remembers hearing the sound of drums and also seeing someone leave the inn at that moment, and this allows Haruo to solve that mystery. The protagonist waits for Chitanda as she exits the hot springs, and upon returning to the inn, he tells her what he deduced. During the night, Keo wanted to go to the summer festival using Ri's yukata, but she was sure her sister wouldn't lend it to her, so she borrowed it secretly and went to the festival, and she's the person he saw leaving the inn that night. However, it rained that night and it caused the yukata to get wet, and since she knew her sister planned to use it for the fireworks, she hummed the yukata in the room from the story, opening all the windows to dry it as quickly as possible and return it discreetly. But her friends that night mistook the garment for the man from the story. Chitanda, despite knowing the truth, is not satisfied because she realizes that the sisters don't get along well since they are not able to lend each other things. However, at that moment, she sees the sisters together and realizes she was wrong, pleasing her. Chapter 8. After a few days, an anonymous person receives a message in which someone apologizes for a job they couldn't fulfill. This anonymous person receives a recommendation from someone who might be useful and then invites them to a meeting place with their friends, knowing they are in the Classics Club. The next day, Satoshi and the protagonist arrive at the Classics Club where Mikaya is waiting for them to scold them for being late. But then Chitanda arrives, somewhat agitated and excited, as she asks them to go see a preview of a mystery movie that Class 2 will present. Then the four of them head to the audiovisual room where the screening will take place, and when they enter, they are greeted by Fuyumi Arisu, the member of the class who invited the young woman. Apparently, Satoshi knows the student, but she doesn't seem to remember him, so Mayaka asks her friend what her relationship is with Fuyumi, and she replies that their families have known each other for a long time. The young woman asks the members to watch the movie and then give their opinion. She also explains that for the time being, they haven't given it a name, so they just call it Mystery. Once the movie begins, she leaves the room and wishes them good luck, something that arouses suspicion in Haodaru. At the start of the screening, you can see 6 students going on a field trip. Upon arriving at their destination, they have nowhere to stay, so they decide to spend the night in an abandoned hotel and separate to see the rooms after finding the keys to each one. But as time passes, everyone returns to the meeting point except one, so they go out to look for him. But at the end of one of the hallways, they find him lying on the floor in a locked room, and that's how the screening ends, leaving the club members surprised. Fuyumi returns, and the boys tell her that the movie is incomplete, but the student asks them to figure out who is behind the crime. During the screening, Satoshi and Chitanda were attentive the whole time, while the protagonist and Mayaka were not so interested. But at the end, Mayaka gives her opinion and believes that the movie is somewhat childish and cannot end like that. Fuyumi says the reason is that the scriptwriter fell ill, so she wants them to find out the culprit since she knows they were able to solve other mysteries like Hyouka. The protagonist suspects that perhaps the librarian mentioned it to her, although he's not very convinced to do this job, but after the student leaves, Chitanda convinces everyone to do it. At the end of the day, the club members go home, and on the way, Satoshi says that Fuyumi is famous because her family owns a hospital near the school and that they nicknamed her the Empress. At that moment, the young man starts giving nicknames to his friends using tarot cards. According to him, Mayaka would be Justice, he would be the Magician, Chitanda the Jester, and for Haotaru, Strength. But the only one who pays attention to him is Chitanda. The next day, Chitanda picks up Haotaru from his house, overshadowing his plans as he didn't want to go to classes. Upon arriving at school, the boys are eager to start the investigation until a student from the audiovisual club comes to fetch the members of the Classics Club to introduce them to the amateur detectives to find out who the culprit is in the movie and to finish it. Chapter 9. After the incident, the club members prepare to listen to each member of the audiovisual production as each will give their theory and reasons, so the final of the movie would come from there since the scriptwriter fell ill. The student who led them tells them to give their opinions or objections after hearing each version. While she speaks, Chitanda mentions that she brought liquor chocolates. The club's work begins and the first to speak is Nakaju Jr., the assistant director. He believes the culprit used the window to enter the room, commit the crime, and then leave through the same place. They examine the mansion's blueprint and see that there were only 2 routes, one being the window and the other the front door since the other routes were blocked. Therefore, they believe that the scriptwriter may have based it on the place's plan, so they ensure she might have tried to prevent the culprit from using another route. Nakaju confirms this, stating that the scriptwriter checked the place before filming. Mayaka gives her opinion, thinking that if Nakaju's theory were true and the culprit entered and exited through the window, the movie would be very boring. Additionally, the boys believe that if that were the case, the criminal would have left a trail on the lawn since it was very high. Once Nakaju's theory ends and the student leaves, Chitanda disagrees with that argument, so Haotaru believes there is something contradictory in the theory, as if the culprit entered through the window. The other students would have seen him from the other rooms. The second to speak is Haba Tomohiro, who is part of the team, but before that, the protagonist asks the student who led them for the movie script to better deduce the case. Haba makes it clear the scriptwriter was not an expert in mysteries since she never addressed the topic and looked for information about it in Sherlock Holmes books. Returning to the theory, the student says it's quite simple since the scriptwriter asked for a rope that could hold the weight of a person plus a bottle of red liquid. According to him, the culprit, unable to enter through the room's door, used the rope to descend from the second floor, entered the room through the window, committed the crime, and then went back up. Once the student leaves, the boys don't seem very convinced, but for Chitanda, something doesn't add up. So Haotaru says that from what was seen in the video, the window was very difficult to open, making it impossible to enter through there. Additionally, the victim would have seen the criminal hanging from the rope, giving him time to escape. And if the scriptwriter checked the place before filming, she would have noticed this, so the window was not important to her. Later, the student arrives to deliver the script, and the boys see that it is really detailed. Finally, the third detective named Sawakaguchi arrives, and her theory is based on the fact that mystery movies tend to mix with horror. Furthermore, the scriptwriter was looking for a seventh member, so the culprit would be that person, as they could be a mysterious who would later kill each student in the movie, although a couple would survive and have a happy ending. However, none of them are convinced, as only a bottle of red liquid was requested, and it wouldn't be enough for everyone. Then the club members go home. Mayaka accompanies Chitanda as she ate all the liquor chocolates and got drunk, while Satoshi and the protagonist go together and talk about how they discarded all the theories, so the movie will remain incomplete, which is a shame. When Haru is alone, he sees Fuyumi on the other side of the street, who asks to talk to him. Chapter 10. After the incident, Fuyumi invites the protagonist to have tea and discuss the movie, asking for his opinion on his classmates' theories. Upon hearing that the young man didn't like any of them and giving his reasons, the student asks him to help solve the mystery because she heard great things about him, and if it weren't for that, she would have chosen any of the three theories. People who spoke highly of him were Chitanda, the librarian, and someone outside of school. This makes her realize that he's an extraordinary person, although he says it was just luck. The next day, Haru and Satoshi head to school, which surprises the student as his friend goes voluntarily on a holiday, something strange for him. So the protagonist says that Fuyumi asked him to solve the case, so he accepted to use it in the movie, but Satoshi believes he does it for Chitanda, or in this case, for the president of the audiovisual club, which bothers the protagonist a little as he says he only does it because he's passionate. Upon arriving at the club room, Mayaka is also surprised to see the protagonist. That day, there were only 3 of them because, according to the girl, Chitanda is hungover from the chocolates. So among the 3 of them, they watch the movie again to gather information. However, they don't notice anything strange, although Mayaka only says that the shots are not good and begins to correct each one, believing that the cameraman was not good. At that moment, a student from the student council interrupts them to look for Satoshi as he is upset because he believes he is wasting time playing with his friends. So he forcibly takes him away, but Satoshi comes back crawling to hand over his notebook with the data he collected, and the student takes him away again. After this, Mayaka says she also has to leave, so Haru is left alone in the club to solve the mystery, and after watching the recording several times, he manages to decipher the screenwriter's intention. Later, the protagonist calls Fuyumi to tell her that he managed to solve the case, so he begins to show her the data he collected along with the recording, and some flaws can be seen in it, such as the cameraman's shots. Additionally, besides the window, the door was the only entrance to the room, so someone must have taken the master key from the office and entered the room and then left it after the crime, but it could only be done in a short time, making it impossible for any of the 6 actors. So his conclusion is that there was a 7th person, as Sawakaguchi said. At first, it was a ridiculous idea, but the screenwriter was looking for a 7th person, which makes this deduction possible, although it is impossible for this person to appear out of nowhere. So upon viewing the tape again, he noticed that there are nonsensical things, and most of it is that the actors occasionally look at the camera, and there's someone always in the dark using a flashlight, but none of the boys had it. So everything points to the cameraman. The young man says there was a moment when everyone went to investigate the rooms, and at that moment, everything becomes dark. And when the recording returns, the cameraman could have gone to the office and taken the master key as he was closer, gone to attack the victim, and quickly returned without anyone noticing. After hearing his version, Fuyumi congratulates him as they can now finish the movie, and she realizes she was right in saying he has talent. Besides congratulating him, she asks him to give the movie a name since he solved it. Houtaro, after thinking about it, named it What No One Noticed. On the day of the premiere, the boys go to the audiovisual room to see the end of the movie, where there are also several students who belong to that club, including the students who gave the 3 theories. At the end of the screening, the protagonist realizes it was a success as Nakaju and Sakaguchi congratulate him for an unexpected ending. While Haba was not happy with the ending as they didn't use his, however, his friends also congratulate him but don't seem happy as Chitanda tries to tell him something but regrets it and simply leaves. When Haru is alone with Mayaka, she tells him that the rope was not mentioned in the movie since she has doubts about the outcome as the screenwriter desperately asked for this element. This makes the protagonist doubt as he can't believe he forgot this element. Chapter 11. After what happened, Mayaka insists that even though the movie had a good ending, she believes it's not the correct one because an important element is missing: the rope, as the screenwriter desperately asked for it. The protagonist thinks that maybe it was an unnecessary element, but he's not so sure about it. The girl leaves and Haru is left distraught. As the protagonist walks through the school hallways, he wonders why he forgot that element and thinks that maybe he did it to make everything fit. At that moment, Satoshi arrives to ask if the idea was his or the screenwriter's. Learning it was his friend's idea disappoints him because, according to Satoshi, the screenwriter wouldn't have resolved it that way since she didn't have experience in mysteries, and those who knew didn't usually use the narrative trick. Haru tries to excuse himself by suggesting that maybe the screenwriter read or saw a different type of mystery story, but Satoshi doesn't buy it and sees it as an excuse. Later, when the protagonist leaves the school, Chitanda stops him and tells him about her thoughts on the story. For her, the screenwriter wrote the end of the script but didn't tell anyone about it even though nobody would criticize her. Back at his house, Haru can't shake off the feelings about the movie since he feels he didn't consider the screenwriter's feelings. To forget about them, he starts reading a tarot book since the club members were discussing it earlier. When he reads his card, which is Strength, he doesn't believe it represents him, but then he realizes it was a joke from his friend since women always manipulate him. However, upon rereading it, he discovers something. The next day, Haru meets Fuyumi only to confront her. When they are together, he asks her what her talent is, to which she tries to respond with deduction, but he stops her as he is upset because she is wrong. He explains that he wasn't the detective in the movie, but rather used him as the mystery writer. Then the protagonist explains that upon reviewing the screenwriter's notes, he noticed it was actually a list of stories where characters live in some and not in others. However, she wanted a happy ending for everyone, but since she wasn't present during filming, there were many improvisations, including one character's crime. When she got sick, they asked the students to come up with theories, and since none convinced her, she called the classic club. The girl only tells him that whether he considers it a lie or not depends on him. The next day, Chitanda asks the protagonist about the movie script, so he tells her his final theory. One of the girls descended with the rope from the second floor and entered through the other window, attacking the victim. But when the victim saw her leaving, she didn't want to be attacked again, so she locked herself in the room and fainted until she lost her life. Concluding with this theory, there is no seventh character except for the story's narrator. Chitanda feels happy as she finally knows the true ending and also believes that she and the screenwriter are similar. Chapter 12. It's a new day, and finally the cultural festival has arrived. Before leaving his house, the protagonist's sister Toma wishes him luck as it's a tradition in the classic club to have problems during the festival. Upon arriving at school, the kids are surprised to see that the clubs have been preparing a lot, as evidenced by the decoration of each one, something that exceeded everyone's expectations. When they arrive at the club, Chitanda eagerly awaits them, feeling that they must give their maximum effort in selling the Hyouka anthologies. However, due to an error by Mayakura, 200 copies were ordered instead of 30, so she feels guilty as it will be difficult to sell so many. Chitanda also admits feeling guilty for not verifying earlier as the president. Now the problem focuses on figuring out how to sell so many copies, and their booth is poorly located with no people around. They propose to talk to the student council president, while Satoshi says he will try to attract attention with his Saturn costume. They put the plan into action, while Haru says he will stay at the booth in case someone comes. Once the festival begins, Chitanda tries to reach the student council. However, she gets distracted at every club she passes, although she tries to concentrate. After some time, she finally manages to reach it, but no one answers. Luckily, a student claiming to be the student council president arrives, so Chitanda tries to ask him to move the club to another place so it's not so far away. However, it's not possible as they can't make a special exception, but he recommends asking other clubs to help sell their books, which they can accept. Chitanda is happy as it's a good idea. Meanwhile, Satoshi isn't fulfilling his part of the plan as he's enjoying himself at the festival, and Mayaka goes to her manga club where she didn't agree with the costumes but still did it. Finally, the protagonist is in the club room, bored, although he says that after each member bought some copies, sales are going well. However, he gets bored and goes outside for a moment, seeing the festival in the distance. But he gets bored again and returns to the room. At that moment, a student dressed in a peculiar way enters and decides to buy a copy. Haru tries to act normal as it's his first customer. At the end, the student says he likes the pen the protagonist is using, which happens to be the one his sister gave him in the morning. So without any problem, he decides to give it to him, and in return, the student gives him a ribbon for 7th place. Meanwhile, Chitanda continues to waste time getting distracted by the other clubs. Chapter 13. The first day of the festival continues and Satoshi decides to participate in one of the events, a questions and answers game, stating that he will use his database to prove who the true trivia king is. When the game starts, he's very enthusiastic and confident in his answers, getting them all right. He even manages to make it among the top 4, claiming that his plan to get some attention worked. However, there's a student named Tiny who knows him and distracts him a bit, seeing this final as a competition between the two. At that moment, the presenters call Satoshi, and he takes advantage of the moment as planned, starting to advertise that he belongs to the classic club. Some were surprised as they didn't know about the club. Satoshi talks about how his club created an anthology, revealing a big secret about the Canada Festival related to its origin, which can only be discovered by buying a copy for just 200 yen. While all this is happening, Haru listens to his friend's advertisement from the clubroom. At that moment, Chitanda arrives and leaves all her belongings on the table, but tells her companion that the president didn't agree to move the booth. Instead, he suggested talking to other clubs for help with selling the anthologies. Then Chitanda comes up with the idea of talking to the journalism club to request an article about the club. She rushes out, leaving behind all the things given to her by other clubs. Hyouka remarks that she's truly busy. When Chitanda reaches her destination, unfortunately, the student tells her that she's no longer a member of the club and couldn't help her anyway, as they only publish articles about attention-grabbing clubs, although they could make an exception for a good story. Chitanda walks through the school corridors until she reaches a somewhat peculiar booth belonging to the Divination Club. Upon entering, the student there tells her that their fortune wheel was stolen, and in its place, a note was left along with a brochure listing the clubs. Returning to the trivia game, Satoshi doesn't manage to win as he missed the last question. So the contest concludes. Tani tells him that some items were stolen from the Go Club, replaced by a note. Satoshi thinks they simply lost them. Then the student tells him they can't end in a tie, so he will join the cooking competition to determine the winner. Meanwhile, the protagonist is still in the club room but finds some photos of Chitanda taken at one of the booths. He's interrupted by another student who came to buy a copy after hearing the advertisement, feeling intrigued by the story. However, Haotoru tells him he has a problem with his zipper and helps him with a clip that belongs to the ribbon he was given. In return, the student gives him a water. In another classroom, Mayaka is with her manga clubmates, but she's worried as none of their volumes are selling. She thinks there's no chance to sell the anthologies there. Even one of her clubmates starts criticizing the idea they had, making everyone look at Mayaka as if it were her fault. Upset, she stands up and confronts her, saying the idea was good as they did it in previous years. To prove it, she'll bring a manga that was sold the previous year. After the discussion, the girl from the classic club sees even less chance of asking if she can sell the Hyouka anthologies. But when she turns around, several students are waiting in line to buy the manga made by the club. Even when Chitanda goes to that booth, they ask her to come back another day as the books are sold out. When everyone returns to the classic club where Haotoru is, he tells them that a total of 14 anthologies were sold. Satoshi says his advertising plan worked and he'll have more success when he wins the cooking contest. However, Mayaka tells him that there must be 3 participants per group to compete, something he didn't know. So he asks the girls to help him as they have no other choice but to win. After the activities end, Chitanda looks for her belongings and suspects that Haotoru was looking at her photos, making them both blush and feel nervous. When Mayaka returns home, she searches her room for the manga she mentioned in the club but has no luck finding it. Chapter 14. On the second day of the festival, Mayaka apologizes to her club president for not being able to find the manga she mentioned, but the student doesn't give it much importance and only asks her to help put up posters, which surprises Mayaka. Later, the members of the classic club gather and Satoshi informs the girls of the schedule for the cooking contest. Mayaka says she'll be busy but will leave early to make it for the third round as it's allowed. Then Satoshi meets with the committee president, who asks him to deliver some items to the gym. He also mentions going around the festival and hearing complaints from clubs like the a cappella club, who had some belongings taken and notes left in their place. Satoshi recalls what Tani told him, suspecting that something interesting is happening, and he smiles slightly. Meanwhile, Chitanda talks to Fuyume to ask for help selling some anthologies. Although Fuyume agrees, she asks Chitanda to lower the price so she can give them out with her club's brochure, striking a deal. However, the president of the classic club forgot to bring samples, so she must go back for them. Before leaving, she asks her new friend to help manipulate people, and she's very good at getting them to do what she wants. In the classic club room, Haotoru is bored again, but at that moment, 2 students in costume arrive, saying that the pastry club is selling cookies. The protagonist makes a deal with them in exchange for a Hyouka. One of the students also takes the water they had left before and leaves a bag of wheat flour in return. In another scene, Satoshi goes to pick up Mayaka, but seeing she's busy, he leaves since the competition is about to start. The cooking competition is about to begin, so the presenter introduces each participating group. Chitanda takes the opportunity to ask her companion what he plans to prepare. The young man says fried rice with seafood, but he has to go first since Mayaka isn't there and the preparation is done in turns. When it starts, Satoshi is ready, although he faces some difficulties during cooking. Chitanda tries to warn him, but they can't communicate, so she just gestures, but he seems not to understand. Luckily, he manages to finish his dish before his turn ends. Now it's Chitanda's turn, and Satoshi and all the spectators are surprised as she is very good at cooking. Not only does she finish her partner's dish, but she also manages to make several more. Unfortunately, she uses up all the ingredients, and although Satoshi tries to warn her, it doesn't work. When she finally finishes her turn, it's time for the switch, but Mayaka hasn't arrived yet, and to complicate things further, the classic club is short on ingredients. From the manga room, Mayaka hears that it's time for the third cook, so she quickly leaves and heads to the competition, passing by the number of students. After running through the whole school, she manages to make it, and despite being tired, she now has to deal with not having enough ingredients. She gets upset with her friends but tries to think about what to do with what little she has left. However, time is running out. Houtaru listens from the club room as the presenter says their team is running out of time and still hasn't been able to start the third dish due to insufficient supplies. At that moment, he remembers that the students gave him a bag of wheat flour, so he immediately calls out to Satoshi at the top of his voice and asks him to come as close to the window as possible. When he does, the protagonist throws the product to him, and when Satoshi hands it to Mayaka, she immediately comes up with a dish. With the little time she has left, she quickly starts cooking, and with 1 minute to spare, she realizes she's missing a utensil. She complains to the presenter, who promptly hands her one, and luckily, she manages to finish her dish. Once the competition ends and the judges announce their results, they declare the classic club the winner. However, Mayaka complains that she was missing a utensil, so the organizers apologize, although they're sure they checked everything before starting. Chitanda approaches the kitchen and notices a note where the ladle should be, stating that it's lost, signed by Jumanji. Chapter 15. After the events, the kids return to the classic club after winning the cooking competition. They tell Houtaru that they didn't expect him to help, so they were surprised, but they thank him because they won thanks to him. However, Chitanda says she's more interested in what's happening with the note and the lost items. Satoshi mentions that it also happened in other clubs. However, the protagonist only thinks that someone is too bored and starts making jokes, making it clear that he's not interested in investigating. But Chitanda starts looking at him, showing that she's intrigued. So Satoshi came up with the idea of using this topic to promote Hyouka since the advertisements didn't work too well. However, Houtaru refuses to investigate and he finds it difficult to find the culprit among so many people at the festival, not only students but also people from around. However, upon reading the signature, he realizes that it's a pattern and that Jumanji means 10 letters and things were in order of the letters. The club is forced to solve the case as they're the last in the order. Chitanda thinks it's a great opportunity to talk to the journalism club to dedicate an article to them, while Satoshi believes he can gather some clues. Chitanda arrives at the club and tries to talk to them, but she notices they're very busy, and the student asks her to come back later. Although she tries to use the techniques for Yumi taught her, it doesn't work, so she only reveals that objects are being stolen. The student returns and says it also happened in his club, but he needs more information. Later, Satoshi arrives with Chitanda, and they say they're sure the next club will be the Magic Club, so hope are there to catch them as they were about to start a show and the would probably be there. Meanwhile, Mayaka says she must return to the manga club, but before she leaves, she thanks the protagonist for helping her during the competition, although he tells her that now she has to give him something in return, otherwise he'll break the chain of favors that was happening. So she gives him a mirror. In another scene, Satoshi goes to the magic salon to catch the and to his surprise, there are also several familiar students who came to watch the show, although Tani also went for Jumanji. Once the show starts, the young man realizes that the thief is already acting, as one of the candles that were part of the show is missing. Later, Chitanda sees that the journalism club published an article mentioning Jumanji, but they also named the classic club. She's happy because at least they got mentioned. Meanwhile, Satoshi returns to the club and tells his friend that he didn't manage to catch him. So Houtaru says he just has to wait for him to come to the club, and he also believes that won't act during the show. When all the members arrive at the club, they see that the sales are going normally. That night, none of them can stop thinking about their problems and they feel tired. Chapter 16. On a new and final day of the festival, Satoshi arrives at the club room where the thief will attack, but is surprised to see Tani and other students there to catch Jumanji. He believes they might attack the contest club, but since it has already ended, he's not surprised. Some students begin to lose interest in the case and slowly leave, while Satoshi thinks Jumanji might be hiding from people. However, he overhears Tani receiving a message saying the thief has already struck elsewhere, this time at the Light Music Club. Satoshi deduces it's an indirect attack, leading him to believe the attacker adapts more than expected to the situation. Meanwhile, Chitanda crosses paths with a woman in the school halls and feels she's seen her before, unaware she's Houtaru's sister who visited the club. Noticing her brother's boredom, she buys him a Hyouka and decides to take the mirror Mayaka gave him, leaving a copy of a manga, which surprisingly turns out to be the one her friend was searching for. Tomo tells her brother it's up to him whether he wants to read or not. Later, Chitanda arrives with Satoshi at the club and sees Houtaru engrossed in reading the manga. Spotting the similarity between the book's cover and a poster near the meeting room, she borrows the manga to investigate despite the protagonist's request to return it quickly. Meanwhile, Mayaka is diligently working in her club when an accident involving her colleague splashing dirty water on her makes her upset, prompting her to leave. After changing clothes, she encounters Chitanda, who has the manga Mayaka was looking for. However, her friend expresses doubts about the cover and the poster, so they both set out to investigate. Upon discovering the similarities, they inquire at the meeting club and learn that Kuviyama Minayoshi, the student council president, drew the poster. They then inform the others. Houtaru also reads that the manga is called Aju Takua, so he privately tells Satoshi that something doesn't add up as there seems to be a connection between the manga and the ongoing thefts. Despite feeling confident he can catch the Satoshi becomes anxious to know who the culprit is. Once he calms down, he wishes Haotoru luck. Meanwhile, Chitanda is on the radio show she was invited to, intending to promote the club. However, things don't start well as she gets nervous and has a small accident. Chapter 17. After the incident, Chitanda conducts a radio broadcast promoting their anthologies, trying to convince people to buy them since they cover important topics. She also urges listeners to come to the club room to protect the last item that will, as it's their club where the will strike before the festival ends, and they want to catch him. After the broadcast ends, several students gather in the club, and many of them purchase the anthologies attended to by Haotoru. Although their target is Jumanji, the other club members surround one of the copies of Hyouka, as it will be the target. After some time passes, the kids feel nothing will happen and everyone is getting bored. But then Satoshi's phone rings, making everyone look towards it in alarm. However, seconds later, there's an explosion among the anthologies, causing a small fire. When Satoshi manages to extinguish it, Mayaka notices a note from Jumanji saying he has completed his list, leaving everyone feeling regretful for not being able to fulfill their plan. The festival ends and Fuyumi hands over the proceeds from the anthology sales to Chitanda. However, she also takes the opportunity to tell Chitanda that she heard her on the radio and believes she shouldn't follow her advice as she's not good at it and demonstrates dependency. Chitanda understands because she feels the same way, uncomfortable with it, so it's not her thing. Later, when Satoshi is with Mayaka, talking to a student about expectations, a memory from a few minutes ago comes to his mind. His friend Haotoru was secretly talking to Tanab outside the school, accusing him of being Jumanji. His reasons were that in the letters he saw the word lost instead of and he noticed the word ku, perhaps attempting to leave a message for someone whose name starts with those letters, namely Kugiyama Munioshi, the student council president. He deciphered this thanks to hints using the festival Kamiya list, where all the victims were in order and Kugiyama. He realized it was him because only the executive committee members could control the names of the pages, and there are 20 members. However, he could deduce it from the manga his sister gave him, where the committee president worked with the author. Believing Kugiyama lost the manuscript, Jumanji started this incident to blame him. There was only one person who could have done it, knowing the manuscript, signed as Ajuma Takuha on the manga cover, writing the first letters of each member, so it had to be someone who participated in the previous festival, belonged to the executive committee, and whose name starts with Te and G. Tanab Jiru. The young man applauds him, as he didn't think anyone besides his friends would decipher the code. Meanwhile, Satoshi is surprised and says his friend exceeded his expectations. However, everything changes when he hears Haotoru asking for something in return for his silence, so he asks him to buy 3 copies of Hyouka and sell them online as their club is doing. Tanab isn't very convinced, but after hearing his reasons, he agrees as they both will benefit. The protagonist says he'll help him complete his list and even tells him how to act since there will be too many people. So between the two of them, they devise a plan for the executive committee member to deliver his message and the club to sell their copies. Satoshi overhears this and feels a little disappointed in his friend. Upon returning to the conversation he was having with Mayaka, he tries to conceal it. After the festival has concluded, Mayaka returns the manga to the protagonist after sorting out her club's affairs. When all the classic club members are gathered, they realize there are only 4 copies of Hyouka left, so Satoshi suggests each of them buy one, and thus the anthology sale was a success. However, Chitanda says she still feels curious about Jumanji, so Satoshi tells his colleagues to have a celebratory dinner, and there Haotoru can tell them everything he has discovered. The girls are amazed and excited to find out who is behind the Chapter 18. On a new day, the classic club is gathered, and at that moment, a helicopter passes by, so Satoshi gets up to see it from the window. With that act, the protagonist remembers his English teacher Oji, who liked helicopters, and when he mentions this to the others, Chitanda confuses the name of the student from school. Haotoru explains that it was a teacher the kids had before. Although Satoshi remembers him, he's convinced that he didn't like helicopters. So the protagonist is surprised because he thought his friends already knew this because the teacher mentioned it with a smile during class. Due to this, they begin to doubt why only Haotoru remembers it that way, so he tries to talk about the time the helicopter flew over the school, although Mayaka says that happened often, and she never saw the teacher react in a certain way. Even Satoshi says that once a squadron flew over the school, which was a great spectacle, but the teacher didn't seem to care, so the protagonist believes that maybe Oji wasn't there. All this awakens new memories in Haotoru because at the beginning of his teaching, he was really strange. Then Satoshi says that Oji had other stories that were hard to believe, and one of them is that he was struck by 3 lightning bolts. But he doubts it since he heard it from the same teacher. After hearing this, Haotoru starts thinking about what his friend said, so he says he'll check newspapers. And for that, he needs to go to the public library, asking the others if they'll accompany him. Satoshi thinks he's sick or not the same person they know, and Mayaka tells him to go home and rest, but he says he even felt embarrassed to say that. However, the only one who accompanies him is Chitanda, but when she sees a couple of students leaving together on a bicycle, She starts imagining what it would be like to go with Haotoru on his bicycle, so she sees it as something impossible. So she simply asks him to go ahead and ask for information about the teacher in the newspapers as he will walk there, and they will meet later. Upon arriving, Chitanda is waiting for the protagonist with a newspaper stating that a group of climbers would go on a hike to collect debris along the trail, and the president of that group was Ojimasa Kyo. There's also an interview with some words from the teacher, stating that due to many new people who didn't know the rules, he wanted everyone to understand that rules are there to protect them. This makes Haotoru feel that his deduction is correct. They approach the librarian on the second floor and ask for information in newspapers from 3 years ago with the word stranded, so Chitanda begins to suspect what her friend meant. They get 12 articles as a result, and in one of them, there's news that there were difficulties in rescuing stranded people in the mountains, so they both ask to see the newspaper but must wait until they can find them. After waiting for a long time, the kids see the newspapers, and the first thing Haotoru notices is the publication date. And it's the same date that Oji said he liked helicopters, only in different years. Upon reading the headline, it confirms that some team members were stranded, so Chitanda asks him to explain. The protagonist says that his teacher didn't like helicopters, and when stranded in the mountains, it's likely that he was struck by lightning, because the weather wasn't good on that date and storms tend to be stronger in those places. Besides, it fits because he was a mountaineer, and the reason why that time in class he approached the window upon hearing a helicopter and said he liked it is because while stranded, he eagerly hoped to see one, but in that case, it would be a rescue one. When Chitanda hears this, she starts feeling distressed. As they leave the library, Chitanda asks him why he was so curious about that topic, to which Haotoru says he wanted to know if what he thought was true since he should be careful about saying that his teacher liked helicopters when he didn't, as simply seeing one reminded him of those bad days. Chapter 19. After several days, Haotoru and Chitanda are at the Classics Club, each reading their own book. The protagonist pauses for a moment to look at the Hyouka Anthology displayed in a showcase as a great achievement. He takes the opportunity to ask his friend about Jun Sekitani's funeral, to which she says everything went well. However, she also tells him she plans to visit the grave and asks if he would like to accompany her and light incense, since he helped her uncover the truth about her uncle. Despite not expecting this proposal, he agrees. She also expresses her surprise, calling him an extraordinary person for solving many cases. However, the protagonist attributes it to luck, as he doesn't know how he came up with those theories. To prove he's just speculating, he suggests they create a theory. But at that moment, they hear a school announcement asking a person who bought something the day before at Kobandu in front of the station to report to the office immediately. Chitanda suggests they form a theory about the announcement, and when he agrees, she takes notes of the announcement's details. They then begin to deduce the message, starting with what Kobandu is. Chitanda explains it's a store in front of the station. She also mentions that Shibazaki, the school director, is looking for a troubled student. Chitanda leans over to see Haotoru's notes, and inadvertently, they both turn to face each other but blush and try to pretend nothing happened. The protagonist suggests Student X could refer to an individual or a group of students, but since they were called immediately, he believes the director will discipline them for something bad they did. He deduces it's likely a crime because announcements are usually repeated twice, but in this case, it was announced only once during the second break when most students were not around, indicating the culprit is within the school. After a while, Haotoru deduces that since the police were not called to the school, the incident must have occurred the previous day. However, since the announcement was made today, the investigators likely just made the request and want to arrest the culprit immediately. As they continue to ponder the matter, Haotoru realizes he's taking it too seriously and reminds himself it's just a game, so he should relax a bit. However, he begins to speculate that if Student X were not guilty, the director wouldn't be in such a hurry, leading him to believe there might be a He also suggests the investigators are looking for someone with specific characteristics because the announcement was too descriptive. Another possibility is that the culprit turned themselves in by writing a confession letter out of remorse. However, Chitanda interrupts, questioning how the investigators knew to come to the school. Haotoru suggests they may have asked the store owners if they remembered anyone with a particular characteristic or uniform. He then theorizes that the culprit may have done something at that moment to attract attention and may not have committed a crime in plain sight. Instead, they may have felt remorse and admitted their guilt with the letter. After thinking for a while, he considers the possibility that the student used a counterfeit bill for a purchase. Chitanda becomes agitated, finding it hard to believe, and leans in too close to Haotoru, who asks her to calm down. She suggests that bills are difficult to recognize and obtain, so the student may not have realized, or if they did, may have regretted using their own money. Haotoru adds that it's possible the person who gave them the fake bill is from high society, making it difficult for the student to refuse. He believes this person may have more counterfeit bills, prompting police involvement to trace their origin. After spending the day deducing the matter, Haotoru concludes his theory, but gets a little annoyed that Chitanda hasn't said a word. However, she then asks about the purpose of the person who initiated the game, to which he responds that he doesn't remember. She suggests they investigate until they find out, but the protagonist just wants a break. The next day, when he wakes up and sits down for breakfast, he reads the newspaper and learns that a has been arrested for using counterfeit bills. Chapter 20. The chapter begins with the protagonist and Chitanda locked up, wondering how they got into that situation. In another scene, Haotaru's day begins when he receives a call from Chitanda asking what he's doing for New Year's since she invites him to the temple, mentioning that the others will also be there, so the young man accepts. In the evening, the protagonist waits in the cold for his friend, and when she arrives, the first thing he notices is the kimono she's wearing and how lovely she looks in it. On the way, she mentions she's there for family matters and had to act cute all day, leading Haotaru to think she's trying too hard, contrasting with how he spent the day mostly lying down. After offering their prayers, they arrive at the temple where they are received by the caretaker, who greets them warmly since Chitanda is part of his family. Later, they meet up with the shrine maiden, which surprises Haotaru. The girl gives him his gift and wishes him a happy new year, then asks about Satoshi, leaving the protagonist confused about how she knows his friend. The girls explain they are in the same grade at school, which is how they know each other, and her name is Kaho Jumanji. Later, the group visits Mayaka, who is working at the temple. She mentions that Satoshi was there earlier but left to watch a series, likely returning later. She explains she's there to sell amulets and also oversees lost items and lost children, keeping her busy all day. Chitanda requests an amulet, and as she receives it, Mayaka tells her it will bring blessings throughout the year. However, Haotaru receives one indicating misfortune. When they are alone, Chitanda expresses surprise since she has never seen one like that before. At that moment, Kao informs the group that there was an issue with one of the assistants, and they need to prepare another soup. Chitanda offers to help, but the shrine maiden refuses. After much insistence, Kaho finally agrees to let her go to the storeroom to get Sake to prepare the meal, and the protagonist offers to accompany her. Upon arrival, Chitanda notices something strange, while Haotaru follows his instincts and searches for what was requested in the darkness. However, Chitanda informs him they are in a shed and they were supposed to go to the storeroom. Haotaru is surprised and apologizes for the misunderstanding, explaining they don't have a storeroom at their house. However, this reaction was just his imagination and he wonders why she didn't mention it earlier. Suddenly, the door closes and they realize they are locked in the shed in the snow and cold. Later, the protagonist feels guilty and suggests shouting for help as loudly as possible, but Chitanda covers his mouth, asking him not to do it since she is there representing her father, and seeing them in that situation could lead to misunderstandings. The only solution is to notify their friends via cell phone, but none of them brought theirs. After thinking for a while in the cold, Haotaru suggests 4 possibilities to escape: breaking the door, breaking the wall, digging to escape, or breaking the roof. However, Chitanda dismisses all of them as they cannot damage the temple property. Through a small hole, they see a temple assistant passing by, picking up a lost item and heading to the temple office where Mayaka works. The protagonist suggests enlarging the hole slightly to throw an item recognizable by Mayaka, who could then come to their rescue since they are freezing. Chitanda throws her handkerchief, believing her friend would recognize it. The passing assistant takes it, making the pair happy, but now they just have to wait. Meanwhile, Satoshi arrives at the temple, and the first thing he does is visit Mayaka. Upon arrival, she shows him Chitanda's handkerchief, suggesting it might be hers, but he replies he can ask her when he sees her. The boys are still trapped, knowing the plan didn't work, so Haotaru decides to throw his wallet. All of his friends don't notice it's his. As none of their plans were working, they were beginning to give up. However, they remember their friend is already at the temple, and the protagonist comes up with an idea to communicate with him, using his companion's purse and a cord. When Mayaka receives the package, she suspects something is wrong and shows it to Satoshi. Upon seeing the wrapping, he realizes the boys are trapped and in danger, so he rushes to find them. Meanwhile, in the shed, Haotaru explains that the meaning of the wrapping, when tied on both sides with no exit, indicates someone is trapped inside. This knowledge comes from a novel they read the day before. Fortunately, after waiting for so long in the cold, Satoshi arrives and opens the door, setting them free. Chapter 21. On Valentine's Day of the previous year, Satoshi didn't want to receive the chocolate Mayaka prepared for him because he was expecting more than just a simple, heart-shaped melted chocolate. This upset Mayaka so much that she broke her gift and proposed to make him a masterpiece for the next year until he accepts, and then he'll have to give her an answer. In the present, Mayaka and her friends are in the club and she feels frustrated and upset because she has to make chocolate from scratch for Satoshi. If he refuses the gift again or complains, she will retaliate against him. Chitanda says she'll help, and they plan to go shopping at a store. Mayaka asks her not to reveal their conversation as it's a secret, but Haotaru, who is nearby, overhears their revenge plan. Mayaka f***s him too, so he won't say anything. On his way home, the protagonist meets Satoshi, who invites him to play video games. To Haotaru's surprise, Satoshi has changed, he loses the game but doesn't get angry like he used to in high school. Meanwhile, Mayaka and Chitanda are shopping and Mayaka is nervous about what to choose. Fortunately, her friend is there to calm and support her. Mayaka then asks if Chitanda likes someone, causing Chitanda to blush and whisper the truth in her ear. The next day is Valentine's Day. The protagonist wakes up and finds a gift at his door from his sister Tomo. He leaves it on the floor and kicks it into his room. On his way to class, Haruo meets Chitanda and asks about her chocolate preparation. She says they managed to finish, but it was a struggle. She also feels a bit embarrassed because her friend will only leave the gift at the club and then go to the manga society. Chitanda stops abruptly, remembering it's Valentine's Day, and tells Haruo that her family doesn't usually give gifts to people who aren't really close. This makes them both nervous, leaving them speechless, but they change the subject when they hear a student talking about the weather changing due to snow, so they simply move on and go to class. Later, Haruo meets Satoshi, who says he'll go to the club, but Haruo informs him that Mayaka will be at the manga society. Satoshi decides to go where Mayaka is. Meanwhile, Chitanda arrives at the classic club and sees her friend's chocolate, eagerly waiting for someone to pick it up. However, time passes and she goes to the library to find Haruo, telling him that she left for a moment, and when she returned, the chocolate was gone. Satoshi is also missing and he doesn't seem happy. Because of this, the protagonist has no choice but to help and postpone going home as he doesn't want to deal with Mayaka. When they return to the club, Chitanda and Satoshi mention they ran into each other on the way. Upon entering the club, they find the chocolate missing. They recall seeing a guy putting up a sign on the stairs and ask him if he saw anyone pass by, since that was the only entrance to the top floor at the time. The student says he only saw them, narrowing down the suspects to the clubs on that floor: light music, astronomy, philosophy, and theirs. They decide to go to the astronomy club, but when a student greets them, Chitanda shouts at them to return the chocolate. The boys have to intervene, but when Haruo asks if any members of the club left their room, the girl gets upset, feeling accused, and says none of them did. When they return to the classic club, Mayaka shows up. Unable to hold it in, Chitanda confesses that due to her carelessness, the chocolate was Mayaka asks her not to apologize, but still leaves the club to go home. Chitanda feels distressed and decides to go look for the culprit, but Haruo stops her. She gets angry for the first time and yells that it's her fault, so she can't forgive herself, as this day should be her friend's happiest and she ruined it. However, he asks her to stop because he knows who the culprit is but can't do it with her around. According to him, it was one of the astronomy club members who could hide it under her skirt, so he asked her to go home. At the end of the day, the boys head home. On the way, the protagonist asks Satoshi for the bag, noticing that the chocolate is inside, and confesses that he knew from the beginning that he was the culprit. He tells him that now they're even because last year, he helped him with the Golden Web story, but he asks why he did it, because if it was a prank, he would hit him for hurting his friends. Satoshi explains that he became obsessive, wanting to change, but there was a problem with Mayaka, as he didn't want to become obsessed with her. He confesses that he loves her and wants to be with her, but doesn't want to become obsessed. He feels selfish, but if he leaves the bubble he's in now, he'll revert to his old self. However, he says he's considering giving her an answer as soon as possible. Meanwhile, Chitanda catches up with Mayaka on the way and apologizes for what happened. But she says not to because she knows Satoshi has the chocolate, as according to the promise they made, he would give her an answer, so he probably took it and pretended it was, although she feels upset. Later, Satoshi calls Mayaka and tells her he has something to tell her. Chapter 22. It's a new day, and the protagonist receives a call from Chitanda asking for help at the doll festival because her partner had an accident and she needs someone to hold the umbrella beside her. After she explains, he accepts. Upon arriving at the temple, Chitanda mentioned the protagonist must wait for the festival to start while everyone organizes the preparations. Later, the priest arrives to scold the other assistants for the poor organization. Haruo tries not to stand out, but the man notices him and asks if he is Chitanda's companion, to which the young man nervously and fearfully confirms. Although the priest only asks him to wait calmly until it's his turn, this leaves the protagonist at ease, but he feels like he doesn't fit in. After a while, a setback arises as they don't know if construction on the bridge has started. Hateru overhears them and says that it has already started since he had to pass by it on the way and could see it. Everyone becomes agitated and starts looking at the young man, but they send someone to verify it while hoping the boy is wrong. However, upon discovering that it's true, they try to find another route. At that moment, Chitanda sends someone to fetch her friend as she wanted to talk to him. When the young man arrives in his room, the girl is on the other side, so he can't see her, but she still tells him what's happening, so she gives him a message to give to the priest. When the man hears it, he immediately understands, and they choose the proposed route, sending everyone to work. The protagonist prepares for the ceremony and realizes that the outfit doesn't suit him. As the festival begins, all the journalists are ready, but Haruo is amazed to see Chitanda dressed as a doll and by her beauty. Along the way, every sight of the young man becomes different just because of his friend's beauty, although he thinks he shouldn't have come as it goes against his motto to conserve energy. However, he is curious to see Chitanda's face head on, but then a distraction appears, Mayaka and Satoshi, who came to support them both. During the ceremony, the kids are waiting for their friend who is still busy, and Satoshi and Mayaka take the opportunity to tell the protagonist that the outfit didn't suit him. But when the student leaves, the girl thanks Haruo for helping her on Valentine's Day and says that since then, everything has been normal. Later, Haruo decides to leave the feast and goes outside, but Chitanda follows him and sits beside him. They say it was difficult to control themselves all day, but they also talk about the construction because by someone's order from the temple, the construction started on the day of the festival. Therefore, both give their clues as to who could have been responsible, and they both agree. At the end of the day, Chitanda and Haruo walk through the town as the protagonist has to return home. There, the girl confesses that the town needs her because it's her duty as a member and daughter of her father, who is an important figure in the place to maintain the town, and no matter how much she wants to leave, she'll always have to come back because it's a part of her. That's why she asked the young man to come to show him. She also tells him that she was given two options, to take care of the business or to help, so she chose the latter.